Salutations, gentle viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm now going to give a speech about how this House has no confidence in the United Nations. I'm only going to do the proposition side. I'll worry about the opposition side later on. Anyhow, so imagine that Mr. Chair or Madam Chair has introduced me. I rise to my feet. Ladies and gentlemen, this House has no confidence in the United Nations, and here's why. First of all, because it's so undemocratic. Second of all, because it legitimizes tyranny. Thirdly, because it fails in its principal mission to prevent war. And fourth of all, because it is endemically corrupt. So let's go over these in greater depth. It is preposterous that Monaco, with 20,000 citizens, has as much representation as China with 1.3 billion. What an absurdity. It's grossly unrepresentative. It's just risible. So how can this have any justice at all? If China were to have a degree of representation commensurate with its population, somewhat proportional to its gigantic population, then that would be fair. But it's completely illogical and utterly unjust that a microstate, minuscule Monaco, which has the population of less than one street in China, less than one building, has a representation there, and there are a number of other tiny states which you couldn't even find on most globes who are in the United Nations. Another point is, which is the cruelest government in the world? Is it North Korea? Is it Saudi Arabia? Was it Saddam Hussein's Iraq? Wherever you think it is, they have UN representation long after most countries realized slavery was an absolute abomination. Saudi Arabia continued it to 1962, Mauritania to 1982, and they were still allowed in the United Nations. Saudi Arabia got itself elected to the Human Rights Council. This is nauseating. So this is why it gives respect to these viciously cruel regimes which savagely oppress their people, and we should not be giving our imprimatur even indirectly to such barbarism. And then at the same time, countries with very honourable human rights records, such as say Sweden or Canada, are then castigated by these tyrants who will do anything to misdirect, to come up with whataboutery, to point out the speck in another's eye whilst ignoring the mote in their own. The United Nations was founded before the Second World War was even over in San Francisco, and its primary aim was to avoid war, which they said had twice in our lifetime been such a scourge to mankind. Well, the United Nations signally fails in its principal mission. There were so many UN votes on Iraq, didn't prevent the 2003 war. It's failed to achieve self-determination and freedom for Palestine, being under illegal occupation for decades, and that's because America uses its United Nations Security Council veto. And that's another thing, is it is the big boys club. The victors of the First World War are still there. The United Kingdom doesn't have the population, doesn't have the might to be there. It's illogical that they're there. Likewise, France doesn't have enough sway. These countries don't have clout. China, Russia, the United States, yes, they need to be there. The trouble is, the United States can always protect its client state, Israel, by preventing any UN Security Councils against what Israel's doing against its illegal occupation of Palestine. And Palestine, of course, ought to be a full member of the United Nations, has much greater legitimacy than some member states that I might name. You see, the United Nations has not sorted out the Syrian conflict, has not sorted out the Afghan conflict, the India-Pakistan conflict over Jammu and Kashmir still bubbles on. You look at the Nagorno-Karabakh situation, civil war in Yemen, in which Saudi Arabia and other countries like Iran are intervening. In Nigeria, where Boko Haram causing bloody mayhem in West Africa, likewise in Mali, and the United Nations is completely feeble and utterly ineffectual. So it's a cataclysmic failure in its own terms. At the same time, it breaks national sovereignty by intervening in internal affairs, and it doesn't stop acts of aggression such as NATO bombing Yugoslavia or NATO bombing Libya to overthrow the lawful government of Libya in 2011. I could go on. You could follow their record over this list of calamities. So the other problems with the UN, coming on to corruption, costs so much, and much of it simply lines the pockets of UN officials who are living in such opulence even when they represent countries where many people live in penury. So much public money is pilfered. It is scandalous, but we hear very little about it because that would be undiplomatic. There was sexual abuse has been carried on an industrial scale by the blue helmets that's the United Nations so-called peacekeepers abroad. It is an expensive talking shop at best. And even Kofi Annan, former Secretary General, was called to the great big conference chamber in the sky last week, and he presided over much of this, and his son was one of those who was purloining public funds. So the United Nations also makes wars more likely, not yet less. In the old days, there was a war, there was a decisive result, one side was totally defeated, the other was triumphant, and that was that, and it did not recur. Now we often get a recrudescence of conflicts. They're frozen conflicts, they never actually end. A war starts, the United Nations takes some time to mobilise, then intervenes, has a ceasefire line, and the situation simply protracted. Because of that, the wars don't end with a decisive result. So the UN actually aggravates the very problem that was founded to solve. And that's why people have so little faith in the United Nations. The United States didn't fund it for years, and the United States can get away with anything, with any sort of crimes abroad, with kidnapping people, torturing them, keeping them in Guantanamo Bay for decades without trial or charge. And obviously many member states commit some gross human rights abuses as well, and the UN does nothing about it. So it's completely ineffective, and it does not live up to its mission statement. And these are the reasons why we should have no confidence in the United Nations. And that is why I beg to propose.